The world outside was a mystery, a symphony of sounds and sensations he could hear but never touch. It was a muffled realm of heartbeats, distant voices, and the rhythmic gurgles of life surrounding him. For as long as Elias could remember, he had existed in the warm, fluid embrace of his mother's womb, a cocoon of life and safety that seemed to defy the natural order of time. Elias was not like the others he imagined. He had heard his mother speak of other children, babies who arrived into the world after only months of floating in the same watery haven. But for reasons he couldn't understand, he had stayed. Days turned to months, and months turned to years. Yet the outside world remained just beyond his reach. The boy, whom his mother had named Elias in whispered conversations, felt her love deeply. It wrapped around him as surely as the amniotic sac that housed him, and her every word vibrated through the liquid that surrounded him. "You're my special little boy," she would say, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll always protect you." At first, this love was enough. It was all he knew. He floated in her warmth, lulled by the steady thrum of her heartbeat, the gentle sway of her body as she moved through her day. The rhythm of her existence was his, and in those early days, it was a blissful harmony. But as the months turned to years, Elias began to feel a peculiar sense of wonder, and with it, a growing unease. He could hear snippets of conversations from the outside, voices tinged with curiosity, awe, and sometimes fear. Strangers asked his mother questions that made her heart race, the sharp cadence of her voice betraying her tension. "He's still there?" they would ask. "Yes," she would reply, her tone firm yet weary. "He's fine. He's thriving." Elias felt her hand press gently against her belly, a silent reassurance to both of them. Over time, Elias's awareness expanded. He began to notice the subtle patterns of his mother's days, the rise and fall of her energy, the way her heart quickened when she was excited or slowed when she was at rest. He could even detect her emotions, like ripples through the fluid that cradled him. When she was happy, her warmth felt brighter, her movements more playful. When she was sad, the world inside grew still and heavy. Elias tried to comfort her during those quiet moments. He would stretch out his hand or nudge her belly, hoping she would feel his presence. Her laughter, when it came, was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Are you saying hello, my little miracle?" she would ask, her voice soft and melodic. Elias didn't know what hello meant, but he understood the love in her tone. He pushed back in response, a gentle kick that made her laugh again. Yet, despite their bond, Elias began to wonder. Why couldn't he leave? What tethered him to this place while other children were born, cried, and saw the sun? Time was a strange and elusive thing in the womb. Elias couldn't measure it as the outside world did. He only knew that he had grown. His tiny body, once weightless and free, now filled the space completely. He had learned to fold himself carefully, his knees tucked close to his chest, his arms wrapped around his legs. As he grew, so did his curiosity. The muffled sounds from the outside world painted vivid pictures in his mind. He imagined what the people looked like, the ones who spoke to his mother with such concern. He envisioned their faces pressed close to the curve of her belly, their voices echoing in his sanctuary. He imagined the things his mother described to him: the stars, the ocean, the trees. Her stories became the fabric of his dreams, each word weaving a tapestry of light and color in his mind. "The sky is so big," she would say, her voice tinged with wonder. "You'd love it, Elias. It's like a giant blanket, stretched over everything. And at night, the stars come out. Tiny lights, sparkling just for you." Elias pictured these stars, bright and shimmering, like the glimmers of light that sometimes filtered through his mother's skin. He tried to imagine what it would feel like to see them, to touch them. But the thought of leaving his warm, safe cocoon filled him with both excitement and fear. Elias's connection to his mother was unlike anything he could describe. Her heartbeat was his constant companion, a rhythm that never faltered. When she laughed, he felt it like a dance in his world, the ripples of her joy vibrating through him. When she cried, her sorrow enveloped him, a weight he couldn't shake. Sometimes, he felt her hand rest on her belly, a gesture so familiar it brought him comfort. He would press against her palm, their silent communication spanning the barrier between their worlds. "Why don't you come out, Elias?" she asked one day, her voice soft but tinged with sadness. "Don't you want to see the world?" Elias didn't have the words to answer. He only knew that the outside world felt vast and overwhelming, a place where he might lose the closeness he shared with her. Here, inside, he was safe, loved, whole. But even as he clung to this sanctuary, a small voice inside him whispered of change. It spoke of sunlight and wind, of grass beneath his feet and stars above his head. It told him that, one day, he would need to leave this place. Not because he wanted to, but because it was what he was meant to do. For now, though, he remained. Floating. Listening. Dreaming. His mother's heartbeat was his anchor, her voice his guide, and her love the force that kept him tethered to this tiny, mysterious world. Elias's existence in the womb was one of strange and beautiful isolation, a world where time moved in slow, measured intervals. There were no clocks, no days or nights, only the steady pulse of his mother's heartbeat and the soft murmurs of her voice from outside. It was a sound that felt like home, the most familiar thing in his existence, a gentle rhythm that resonated in his bones. Inside, everything was liquid and soft, warm like the sun on a summer afternoon. The walls of his world, his mother's womb, were ever shifting, like the surface of a pond disturbed by the slightest ripple. At first, they were snug, close, wrapping him in an embrace that soothed every part of him. But as time passed and he grew larger, the space became tighter, stretching to accommodate him. He could feel the gentle pull of the muscles around him as they expanded and contracted, like the slow ebb and flow of ocean tides. He could move, but not far. He would press his tiny hands and feet against the walls, feeling the firm yet yielding texture of the flesh around him. It was a curious sensation, soft and resilient, offering just enough resistance to make him feel alive, yet never truly holding him back. The sensation of touch became Elias's primary sense, for he had no eyes to see the world, no ears to hear the clear sounds of the outside world. His world was tactile, a continuous feedback loop of pressure, warmth, and rhythm. Every movement of his mother, every step she took, sent ripples through the space, jostling him gently, making him aware of her presence even before he could recognize her voice. He was aware, too, of his own movements. His fingers would curl around his umbilical cord, which seemed to pulse with a life of its own, feeding him, nurturing him. He had learned, over time, that this cord was the conduit of his survival. It was as if it was part of him, a lifeline that connected him directly to the source of his existence. Sometimes, Elias would twist or play with it, fascinated by the way it gave way to his touch, as if acknowledging his growing curiosity. The walls of his world were not entirely quiet. Occasionally, there would be a soft, muffled sound, a thump or a tap, as if someone was knocking from the outside. Sometimes, these sounds would be rhythmic, like the soft beat of a drum, the pace of his mother's movements as she walked or rested. The most familiar was the low rumble of her laughter. It wasn't loud, he could never feel the sharpness of sound, but it vibrated through the walls, making the fluid around him ripple, a reminder that she was there, always there, her presence constant and warm. As his senses matured, Elias began to feel more than just the physical sensations around him. He began to sense the subtleties, the changes in his mother's emotional state. There were days when the atmosphere in the womb would grow tense, the walls of his world feeling tight, as if something were wrong. On those days, Elias would grow restless, pacing the small space he had, trying to understand. His mother's heartbeat would race, quickening in response to whatever she was feeling. Fear, anxiety, or even just the anticipation of something unknown. He could feel it all in the way her body moved, how her breath would hitch. When his mother felt overwhelmed, Elias would press against her walls, as if to remind her that he was there, and that he was okay, that she wasn't alone. On days when his mother was calm, the sensation inside the womb was peaceful. There was no rushing, no fear. The heartbeat was steady, soothing, a lullaby he had come to recognize as his own rhythm. On such days, Elias could stretch out, feeling the full extent of his growing body, curling into a ball or spreading out like a little starfish. He would float, weightless, feeling the gentle shifts of his mother's movements as she went about her day. He could tell when she ate something sweet, for the world around him would become infused with a soft, comforting warmth. Chocolate, fruit, or sometimes the tang of a tangy citrus fruit would reach him. These little tastes, though he couldn't truly taste them as humans did, would flood his world with sensation. His body would hum with contentment as he absorbed the nourishment she gave him. There were moments of intense yearning. Elias's small body had no voice, no way to communicate the depth of his desires, but he had learned to send subtle signals, nudges, little movements to remind his mother of what he craved. Sometimes, when the warmth of her food reached him, it felt like an answer. Other times, he would wish for something new, something different, and he would press his tiny hands against the walls of his world, hoping for a new sensation. It was during one of these cravings that he first felt a peculiar connection to his mother's cravings as well. One day, after a meal, he felt a deep tug inside him. She had eaten something spicy, like a dish with curry. And immediately, Elias felt his body responding, his tiny stomach fluttering. It was as though their senses were intertwined, the food she consumed somehow becoming part of his inner world. It was more than just sustenance. It was a bond, an unspoken understanding that her needs and his were interconnected. As he grew, Elias began to notice the small, quiet moments of her life. He could sense the difference between the days when his mother felt peaceful and content, and the days when something troubled her. If she was upset, Elias would feel a deep, gnawing discomfort, a sensation that caused him to curl inward, as if seeking comfort within himself. When she was happy, the world around him seemed to brighten, like a weight lifting off his tiny shoulders. Her joy would ripple through the fluid around him, turning everything light and easy. And then there were the dreams. Elias began to have strange, fleeting visions, moments when he felt as though he were somewhere else, someone else. It wasn't clear. He had no eyes to see, no voice to speak. But in those dreams, there were shapes, colors, and movements that seemed to transcend the limitations of his tiny world. He couldn't explain it, but he knew there was something beyond the walls he now called home. Something bigger. Even as he grew, the walls of his world never fully relinquished their control. There was no true freedom here. Yet, in the midst of his confinement, Elias was not alone. His mother, her heartbeat a constant song, was always there, guiding him, nourishing him, and helping him grow. He knew, even without understanding the full meaning of the outside world, that she was his constant, his protector, the steady rhythm to which he danced. In the warmth and safety of this womb, Elias would continue to grow, nourished by his mother's love, by the food she fed him, and by the rhythm of life that pulsed through every moment of their shared existence. Though he had not yet seen the world, he was already learning the language of life itself. As the months stretched on, Elias's world inside the womb began to change. The small, comforting space that had once been snug and cozy now felt tighter, more confined. His limbs, once curled into a tiny ball, had started to stretch out, exploring the limits of the womb's soft, fluid-filled walls. At first, his movements had been gentle. Subtle nudges here and there, the occasional kick as he responded to a noise or his mother's touch. But soon, those little gestures began to have more force, more purpose. His body grew faster than anyone could have anticipated. His legs lengthened, his arms grew stronger, and his face, hidden from the world outside, formed into the features of a child who was more than a mere fetus. He was a boy, learning and experiencing in the confines of a world no one could fully comprehend. Elias could feel the pressure against the walls of his mother's belly, a constant reminder of how much he had grown. He began to recognize the sound of her heartbeat, no longer just a rhythmic thumping, but a comforting, consistent pulse that accompanied him through every moment of his life. It was like a lullaby, steady and unwavering. But as the months wore on, that lullaby became less and less soothing. There was a tension, a quiet strain beneath her heartbeat. He could feel it in the way she moved, the way she sighed, as though she too was becoming weary of their shared existence. Her stomach had begun to swell in ways that were no longer subtle. It was a vast, stretched landscape, housing not just the promise of a child, but an entire world of life and expectation. Every night, Elias could hear her whispering soft words to him, words of love, of hope, of dreams of the future. Sometimes, her words were filled with laughter, her joy bubbling up in response to the smallest things. But other times, the words were fraught with uncertainty. "Are you still comfortable in there, little one?" she would ask softly, as she sat at her desk or while reading a book. He could feel her pulse quicken when she was anxious, and her voice always calmed him, even as the space around him seemed to grow ever more restrictive. The food she ate began to change too. Her diet, once a mix of simple meals, became more elaborate as her body craved the nutrients she needed to sustain them both. He would feel the warmth of her meals before she even swallowed them, as if he were a part of the experience, like the chocolate cake she'd sometimes indulge in on a rainy afternoon. He could taste it before it touched her lips, a rich, sweet sensation that would fill him with warmth. When she ate fruits, like mangoes or berries, he could feel their sweetness burst into his world, their vibrant colors vivid in his mind despite his lack of sight. His cravings shifted as well. He longed for spicy foods, for tangy salsas, and for hearty stews, the sensation of each bite moving through his mother and in turn, through him. He could almost sense the way the spices tingled on his tongue, as if he too could taste them. Her body was no longer just a vessel for his life. It was a source of nourishment and comfort, and in many ways, it had become Elias's entire universe. Every heartbeat, every word, every meal became a part of his experience. But it wasn't just the physical sensations that defined his growth. He was becoming more aware, more attuned to the emotions that swirled around him. At times, when his mother would cry, Elias could feel the tremors in her chest, the soft shudder of her body as tears fell freely. He couldn't understand her sorrow, but he could sense its weight, the way it enveloped her like a blanket of sadness. It was in those moments that he would press closer, instinctively curling into a fetal position to comfort her. He wanted to tell her he was okay, that he was safe, that she didn't need to worry about him. But all he could do was send a tiny, tender nudge against her ribs, a small reassurance that he was with her, as always. And then there were the moments of joy. When Elias felt her laugh, his world would light up with her warmth. Her laughter reverberated through the fluid, sending ripples of sound and emotion through him. It was like music, like sunlight warming his skin on the sunniest of days. Her joy felt like an invitation, a call to celebrate even the smallest victories of her day, whether it was something as simple as finishing a book she had started, or a surprise visit from an old friend. He could feel the happiness she radiated, and it filled his heart, his tiny chest swelling with a sensation he couldn't quite name. But her growing belly, once a comforting presence, began to press against him more forcefully. Its skin stretched tight as she reached the later stages of her pregnancy. Elias, now the size of a small child, sometimes wondered if there was room for both of them. He wondered if he would ever be able to step out of the dark and into the light. But he never voiced these concerns, for he had no words, only emotions. Yet, despite the discomfort of the confined space, despite the lack of room to stretch freely, there was one thing Elias never doubted: his mother's unwavering love. It was a love so profound that it transcended time and space. No matter how much he grew, no matter how tight the womb became, her love kept him safe, kept him warm, and kept him alive. But Elias could feel the tension increasing within her. The strain on her body was becoming too much to bear. The doctors, who had visited her regularly throughout the years, had started to mention words like danger and complications. They didn't understand why she hadn't delivered, why the child inside her had not come into the world as expected. Some suggested it was a medical anomaly, others spoke of experimental treatments, but his mother refused all of it. She held on to the belief that when Elias was ready, he would be born. He would come into the world on his own terms. The days seemed to stretch on forever, like a dream that would never end. Elias had grown strong enough to hear the outside world with clarity, to feel the vibrations of the earth beneath his mother's feet, to sense the seasons changing. He could feel the warmth of summer turn to the crisp chill of autumn, the gentle breeze of spring through her breath. But through it all, he remained in the same place, a world that no longer felt quite as limitless as it once had. Despite the growing uncertainty, Elias knew one thing with certainty. When the time came, his mother would be there, holding his hand as he took his first steps into the unknown. As the months passed in his hidden world, Elias began to notice something extraordinary. It started as a faint shimmer, a soft glint that would flicker in the darkness of his watery home. At first, he thought it was merely a trick of his mind, perhaps a fragment of a dream or a burst of imagination. But it continued, growing stronger with each passing day. One day, as his mother rested near a large window, Elias felt the shift of light again. This time, it was different. The soft glow, like the first rays of dawn, seeped through the walls of his cozy prison, casting warm patterns on the interior of the womb. It was ethereal, delicate, almost as if the very air outside was sending him a message. He pressed closer, stretching his limbs against the soft surface of the amniotic sac, trying to catch a glimpse. Through the translucent walls, he saw it, light, pure and golden, flooding the edges of his world. It was the first time he had ever seen anything other than the deep, soft shadows that surrounded him. The world outside was a mystery, yet Elias could sense the beauty of it through the warmth of that light. Curious, he spent hours each day near the glowing area, eager to understand what it meant. It was as though something magical had unlocked for him, a secret window into the life he could only dream of. The golden light seemed to breathe life into the world around him, filling the space with a vibrant energy that made the silence of his existence feel less lonely. Then, one evening, as his mother's gentle laughter resonated through the walls, Elias noticed something even more remarkable. The light began to dance. It twisted, twirled, and shifted in mesmerizing patterns, like the reflections of a fire on water. It was alive with movement, shifting with the rhythms of the world outside. Elias watched in awe, his tiny heart racing in delight. The warmth of the light brought comfort, but it also sparked a deep longing within him. He imagined the sun's rays kissing the earth, the soft winds touching the trees, and the endless sky stretching out before him. He could almost feel the touch of the breeze against his skin, the soft hum of life around him. His curiosity grew, and with it, an unspoken understanding that the time was drawing near. He would one day experience it all. Elias's world, once so small, now seemed filled with endless possibilities. Each new discovery, each flicker of light, made him feel more alive, as though the universe was reaching out to him, promising that he would one day belong to it all. Inside the womb, Elias grew increasingly aware of the deep connection he shared with his mother. It wasn't just a physical bond that kept them tethered together. There was something more. It was a quiet rhythm that pulsed between them, an invisible thread that linked their hearts in a dance that neither could break. From the very beginning, Elias had been aware of his mother's presence, of her heartbeat that seemed to match his own, of the soft ebb and flow of her breath as it rippled through the amniotic waters. Her life was his, and his life was hers. But as the days turned into months, something deeper began to emerge, a kind of communication that defied words. At first, it was subtle. A soft nudge in her abdomen would send a ripple of sensation to her body, and she would pause mid-action, her hand gently resting on her belly as though she could sense him. The rhythm of her heartbeat would speed up when she was excited, and Elias could feel that surge of energy, that electric pulse of joy coursing through him. He could almost hear the sound of her thoughts as they wandered, the occasional quiet laugh or the sigh that slipped through her lips when she was tired or troubled. Sometimes, when she would sit still at night, her hands cradling the swollen curve of her belly, Elias could sense the softness in her voice as she spoke to him. "I wonder what you'll be like, little one," she would whisper, her words wrapped in the warmth of love. "Will you have your father's eyes? Or will you be a mix of both of us?" Elias couldn't answer her with words, but he responded in his own way. He pressed his tiny hands against her belly, making her smile in return. He nudged gently, as if to say, "I hear you. I'm here." Over time, their bond deepened, and Elias became more and more attuned to his mother's emotions. The quiet hum of her sadness would reach him like a distant storm, her sorrow touching him in the most profound way. Her doubts, her fears, her quiet moments of uncertainty, they were all there, woven into the fabric of their shared existence. But there was something else, too. He could feel her love, immeasurable, constant, an unspoken promise to protect him no matter what. One day, as Elias lay in the comforting fluid surrounding him, he felt a wave of distress pass through his mother. Her heartbeat was erratic, faster than usual, a quickened pace that echoed her growing anxiety. He sensed her sitting alone in a room, her hands pressed to her belly, her voice trembling as she spoke softly to herself. "I'm doing everything I can, Elias. But what if it's not enough? What if I can't keep you safe in here much longer?" It was a heavy question, one that Elias couldn't answer. But he tried, pressing his tiny hands and feet against her belly, his little body a silent gesture of reassurance. It was all he could give. But his mother needed more than that. She needed to hear his voice, to know he was okay. And then, in that moment, a strange thing happened. Elias didn't just sense his mother's distress. He felt something shift within himself. A deep, overwhelming urge to reach out to her. His tiny heart began to race in rhythm with hers, matching her pulse beat for beat. He pushed against the walls of her womb, just a little bit harder, trying to send his own strength into her. His tiny movements, once merely a playful kick or stretch, now felt like a message of strength. "I am here. I am strong. We are not alone." His mother sat there, her hands resting on her belly, her voice soft as she spoke again. "I don't know how much longer we can stay like this, Elias. I'm so afraid of what's out there for you." Her fear mingled with his own. He could feel it, like a shadow that loomed between them. But his own response, though tiny, was a flicker of courage. She felt his movements then, stronger and more persistent. It was as though he was telling her, "Don't be afraid. I am ready. We will be okay." The next morning, as Elias shifted inside her, he could hear her speaking to herself again, her words now calm, though laced with a tenderness that made his heart ache. "Maybe I'm being silly," she murmured. "You've always known more than I give you credit for, haven't you?" Elias wanted to tell her that yes, he knew. That somehow, in a way that defied explanation, he understood her love, her fear, her dreams, and her sacrifices. It was all encoded in the rhythm of their hearts, the quiet pulse that filled the space between them. It wasn't just his mother who fed him physically, nourishing his growing body with the food she ate, the fluids that passed through her bloodstream, the vitamins that filled her cells. It wasn't just that he craved strawberries or cheese or spicy food. No, Elias fed on her emotions too. Her love became the very air he breathed. The tenderness of her voice was the melody he clung to. When she sang softly to him or whispered her dreams for the future, those moments of connection nourished his spirit, shaping him into something more than a tiny, unborn child. But there were moments when his mother's love, though fierce and endless, was tempered by her loneliness. Elias could feel her yearning for the life outside her body, for the days when she would hold him in her arms, when the world outside would welcome them both. Her days were filled with moments of quiet reflection, waiting, hoping, for the day when Elias would finally come. Through it all, Elias had become something more than just her child. He had become her constant companion, her silent witness to her joys and fears, her hopes and doubts. The space between them, the barrier of skin and muscle and flesh, was nothing but a thin veil that couldn't obscure the profound bond they shared. He was her heart, and she was his world. And in that bond, in that sacred space where their hearts beat as one, they were inseparable. No matter the distance, no matter the time, they would always have each other. Elias knew, deep in his very being, that when the time came for him to leave, he would carry her love with him, just as she would carry him in her heart forever. And so, even as he wondered when he would step into the world beyond, Elias found peace in the knowledge that no matter what happened, the bond between him and his mother was stronger than anything the world could ever offer. It was an unbreakable thread, woven with love, trust, and a shared understanding that only they could truly comprehend. As the years passed, the world inside Elias's mother's womb became less of a physical space and more of an emotional landscape. The small, fluid-filled universe that once seemed so confined to him had grown vast in ways he hadn't expected. His world was defined by sensations, movements, and above all, the voices and presence of the one person who truly existed within it, his mother. But with each passing day, his mind grew more aware, more curious. Elias had long since grown accustomed to the feeling of being rocked gently by his mother's movements. Her steps were like waves to him, rhythmically swaying him back and forth. But now, those same movements began to mean more. They became his calendar, his understanding of the outside world. When she got up in the morning, her movements were quick and sharp, her body full of energy, and Elias felt a surge of excitement. This was the beginning of her day, and in some way, it was the start of his own too. During the quiet moments, especially at night when she rested, Elias could hear the soft, steady beat of her heart, the pulse of life that connected them. In those silent hours, when the world outside seemed to fall away, he would close his eyes and let the sound of her heart lull him into a peaceful slumber. But at the same time, he would imagine what it would be like to leave this safe place, to feel the air on his skin, to stretch his legs out and walk with her. Despite the warmth, the safety, and the nourishment he was given, Elias knew there was something else, something beyond this womb. He couldn't understand it, but he felt it in his bones. It wasn't a sense of loneliness, for he was never alone, but rather, it was a feeling of longing, of an existence outside that he couldn't yet reach. As Elias grew, so did his senses. What started as a vague collection of sensations became a detailed, almost sensory map of the world. He could feel the movement of his mother's muscles as she stretched or yawned, the soft pressure of her fingers when she gently rubbed her belly, the changes in temperature when she stepped outside or when the seasons shifted. One of the most profound shifts in his understanding came when he learned to feel the subtle fluctuations in her emotional state. When she was happy, he could feel a warmth, a lightness that seemed to ripple through the walls of her belly. Laughter, in particular, was a sensation that he came to cherish. When she laughed, whether at a joke or something that made her smile, Elias felt a flutter inside, a kind of joyous energy that filled him completely. But it wasn't just her laughter that he felt. When she was sad, he could sense it too. The world inside would become heavier, slower. The walls that once felt gentle now seemed to hold him with a certain weight, as though they, too, were aware of her sorrow. He didn't understand all of it, but he knew that she was his protector, the one person who could comfort him, even when she herself was struggling. It was during these moments of emotional connection that Elias felt the most in tune with his mother. Over the years, they developed a silent communication, one that didn't require words but rather a deep, unspoken understanding. When his stomach would grumble with hunger, he would nudge gently against the walls of his home, and she would respond. Sometimes, it was a subtle shift, a movement of her hand to her belly as if reassuring him. Other times, he would feel her drink or eat something, and he knew she was offering him what he needed to grow. She would give him the foods that seemed to satisfy him the most: tangy oranges, rich chocolate, comforting bowls of soup. And sometimes, when she felt a longing for something, maybe a memory of a past meal, or a sudden craving, he would feel it too. He would nudge her with his growing hands, and she would laugh softly. "You want strawberries again, don't you?" she'd murmur to him, as though speaking directly to his heart. He imagined that she could somehow hear his silent plea, and she would go out of her way to satisfy it, even if it meant a late-night trip to the grocery store. Elias's understanding of time was strange. Inside the womb, the passage of days didn't have the same structure. There were no clocks, no consistent markers of day or night. But over time, Elias began to understand it through the rhythm of his mother's actions. Morning was when she woke and stretched, the light filtering through the walls of her abdomen as the sun began to rise. She would go about her routine, preparing for work, eating breakfast, and leaving the house. The moments before she left were always the same: a gentle press of her hand to her belly, a soft kiss to her skin. He learned to recognize these moments, marking the transitions from one period of time to another. Night was when she returned home, and the world inside the womb felt a little quieter. She would settle into a comfortable position, her belly cradled by her arms as she rested. As she sat in a chair or lay in bed, Elias would feel the stillness, her tiredness after a long day of work or the weariness that sometimes accompanied her quiet thoughts. Each day, this cycle repeated, And each day, Elias grew. As his limbs stretched and his mind sharpened, he became more aware of the changes within himself and around him. The feeling of movement became more pronounced. His fingers and toes were now capable of touching, curling, and grasping. His body was growing so large that the once expansive space of the womb now felt confined. But with his growth came a sense of yearning, a desire to experience what he had only dreamed about. Elias had no words for it yet, but he knew that something was missing, something vital. He could no longer ignore the distant pull of the outside world, the vague sensation of light that occasionally touched the edges of his existence. One evening, as Elias rested, he sensed a subtle shift. His mother's heartbeat, always steady and comforting, began to slow in a way that unsettled him. Her breath became deeper, more labored, and he could feel the strain in her body, a faint discomfort that rippled through the walls of his world. For the first time, Elias felt a fear, an uncertainty about what was happening. He pressed his hands to the walls of her belly, a silent plea for her to be okay. In that moment, he understood more than ever how deeply connected they were. His safety, his growth, his very life, had been completely dependent on her. And now, as she faced something unknown, Elias could sense that it was not just her strength but his own that would determine what happened next. He felt that the time had come for something beyond his understanding. In the silence, he could almost hear her voice, soft and reassuring, as though she was speaking directly to him. "You're ready," she seemed to say. "When the time comes, you'll know." And for the first time, Elias felt a new sensation. Hope. It was a strange, new warmth, like the promise of something brighter, something waiting for him outside this little world he had known for so long. His time inside was drawing to a close, and though it terrified him, he knew that whatever awaited him, he was no longer alone. The days leading up to the turning point felt like a slow, creeping fog, wrapping itself around Elias's world. He had always been attuned to his mother's feelings, but this shift was different. He could feel it in the subtle changes of her heartbeat, the slow, irregular thrum that reverberated through her body. The rhythm, once so steady and comforting, was now erratic. Her movement seemed more labored, her breath catching in unexpected pauses. Elias could feel the weight of her exhaustion in every shift, in every deep sigh she let out. There was something more, too, a sensation Elias had never felt before. Fear. A strange tremor ran through her body every time she tried to stand, every time she attempted to eat or walk. He felt it as a cool shiver that ran down his spine, a coldness in the otherwise warm fluid around him. It wasn't the usual sensation of her moods. This was different. It was an unsettling stillness, a feeling of something wrong, a sense of impending change. "Mom," Elias thought, even though he had no words for it. He pressed his hands against the inner wall of her womb, feeling the slight vibrations of her voice as she whispered to herself in the stillness. He could tell she was speaking to him, even when her lips weren't moving. Her voice came faint, softer than usual, a whisper of something she wasn't saying out loud. "I don't know if I can keep you in here much longer, little one. I've given you everything I can." The words lodged themselves deep in Elias's mind. He wanted to answer her, to tell her that he was strong, that he was ready. But all he could do was press gently against the walls, trying to communicate his love and appreciation. As the days passed, the changes in his mother became more evident. She had always been active, rising early, taking walks to stay healthy, working, reading, always moving, always giving him her attention. But now she spent more time lying down, her hands resting on her swollen belly as she closed her eyes, sometimes murmuring softly as if comforting herself. Elias felt every pang of her discomfort, every time her body stiffened in pain. One morning, as the light filtered softly through the window, Elias sensed something new, an unmistakable pressure building around him. The walls that had once been soft and warm seemed tighter, more confined. His mother's belly felt harder than usual, and Elias could sense a shift in the balance of his existence. The rhythm of her breathing grew shallow and rapid, the air inside her body thick with an anxiety that was not his own. Her voice, though still faint, now carried an edge of panic. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Elias. I'm so tired." I can't keep you here forever." The words were filled with weariness, a resignation that Elias had never felt from her before. His mother had always been so strong, so certain. But now, the certainty was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Elias wanted to help. He pressed harder against the walls of his world, trying to send her a message, a plea. Could he somehow ease her suffering? Could he take on some of her burdens? But he knew there was nothing he could do. Not yet. The time was coming when he would have to make the decision that would forever change both of them. The reality of his situation settled in. A decision was near. He had been waiting, suspended in time, but now, the world outside was knocking at the door of his existence, ready to pull him into the unknown. At that moment, something shifted in Elias's mind. He realized that the life he had always known, the warmth and the safety of his mother's womb, was not enough anymore. He could feel it. The world beyond was waiting, calling him. It wasn't just his mother's body that had been his world. He had grown, and now he could sense the pull of a greater life, of something beyond the safety of his warm, liquid world. Yet, even as this realization blossomed in his consciousness, Elias felt the sharp pang of fear. The unknown was terrifying. The thought of leaving the only place he had ever known, of stepping into a cold world full of strange sensations and new faces, sent ripples of uncertainty through him. Would he be able to survive outside? Would he still be loved? What if the world beyond wasn't as kind as the space he had known? But in his heart, Elias understood. He had to make the choice to leave, not just for his own sake but for his mother's. She had given him everything. Her body, her love, her patience. It was time to return the gift, to allow her to heal, to reclaim her body and her life. He felt it every time she sighed or shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't physical pain, not exactly, but something deeper, something emotional. A sorrow and a longing that she couldn't quite express. He could sense it in the subtle ways her hands would caress her belly, in the pauses between her words when she spoke to herself or to others. She was torn, and Elias felt that deep in his bones. For so long, he had been content. He was safe inside, cradled by the protective warmth of her body, the sounds of her voice, and the rhythm of her heartbeat. But now, every once in a while, the world outside seemed to press closer, as though it, too, was waiting for him. And with it came an odd sensation. Something pulling him, something calling him to emerge. He began to notice more frequently how his mother's body had begun to change. The walls of her womb, which had once felt like an endless sea, now felt tighter, less accommodating. The space he had once explored freely now seemed too small, like the growing walls of a house that no longer fit its occupant. His limbs brushed against the sides as he shifted, and the once cozy feeling of floating began to feel a bit confining. Elias didn't understand why, but it seemed like his mother's body was subtly telling him that it was almost time. He wondered if she could sense his reluctance, his fears, because she began to speak to him in ways she never had before. When she walked in the garden, she would stop occasionally, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly as she stared at the sky. "The world outside is beautiful, Elias," she whispered one afternoon. "I can't wait for you to see it." Her voice trembled slightly, and Elias could sense her unspoken longing. She wanted him to be free, to experience the life she dreamed for him. He could feel her hopes, her deep love and sacrifice, but also the weight of the years they had spent together. Years that had forged an unbreakable bond between them. The connection was so strong that sometimes, in moments of stillness, Elias could feel her thoughts, her silent conversations with him. He knew she had dreamed of this moment, the moment when he would emerge into the world. Yet, despite her strength, Elias sensed her fear. The world outside was a wild, unpredictable place, and she wasn't sure what would happen when she finally let go. Elias felt the pull too. He felt his body growing stronger, every muscle and bone stretching with the need to expand beyond the confines of his watery sanctuary. He could sense, deep within, that he was ready. But the choice was not as simple as just stepping forward into the light. There were other feelings, other forces at play. He was bound to her in ways he couldn't explain. His entire existence had been defined by her heartbeat, her love, her presence. Could he truly leave that behind? One night, while she slept, Elias found himself pondering the choice more deeply. His tiny hands pressed against the walls of his mother's womb, and he closed his eyes. He could hear her breathing softly, the rise and fall of her chest in perfect harmony with the soft flow of blood that nurtured him. Inside, he realized something. He was not only a part of her physically but emotionally. They had shared every moment of their lives together in this sacred space. He wasn't just her child. He was her companion, her reflection. And perhaps she was his too. It was in this moment of profound stillness that Elias made his decision. The connection between them, so deep, so primal, would never fade, even if he stepped into the world outside. No matter how far apart they might be, no matter how many miles the earth would place between them, the love they shared could never be broken. It would transcend the boundaries of her womb and carry him forward into the unknown with her blessing. Elias understood now that his birth wasn't just about his journey. It was about hers, too. The years she had spent carrying him, feeding him, nurturing him, loving him, were not in vain. They were part of a greater cycle, a movement towards something new, something life-affirming. But the time had come for him to let go. For her sake. For his sake. In the quiet of the night, Elias spoke softly, though no words left his lips. He whispered his thanks to her for every meal, every moment of tenderness, and every breath she took to sustain him. He promised her, in the language of his heart, that he would carry her love with him no matter where he went. And with that, he felt the world shift. The warmth around him seemed to pulse with a finality, as though her body was accepting his decision, allowing him the freedom he had longed for, even if it was with a bittersweet sting. As dawn approached, Elias felt a final surge of energy. The time had come. The choice had been made. He was ready. It was time. The next morning, as the sun's first light filtered through the curtains of the room, Elias felt a gentle guiding pressure from his mother. She shifted restlessly, as though aware of the moment that had arrived. Her fingers, trembling, traced circles over her belly, whispering softly into the quiet air, "It's time, my love. I'll be right here, waiting." Elias pressed his hands gently against the walls around him, as if reaching for something. He felt the last of the comfort and warmth of the place he had called home. But it was no longer enough. He felt the pulse of the world beyond, beckoning him. And together, they both took that final step, into the world that awaited them. Elias's thoughts sharpened. He had been waiting for his mother's signal, for the moment when she would be ready to let him go. And now, as he sensed her body fighting to hold on, he understood. He had to make the choice to be born, to step out of the safe womb and into the life waiting beyond. "I'm ready, Mom," he thought, as the space around him grew tighter, more compressed. "I will come to you." With a final tender push against the walls that had cradled him for so long, Elias felt a change. The pressure inside grew, but now it was different. It was as if the walls had softened, had given way. His body felt the shift. The space was opening. The world beyond was pulling him into its embrace. And with that, the turning point arrived. It was not just the physical shift that signaled the end of his journey inside his mother's body. It was the emotional breakthrough, the realization that he could not remain in her womb forever, that the time had come for him to begin his life in the world outside. His mother's heart seemed to quicken with understanding, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elias felt the first flicker of light, an invitation to something new. The moment was here. The walls around him softened as his mother's body began the delicate, natural process of labor. Elias could feel the changes in her body as she prepared to bring him into the world. He could feel the contraction, the push. The world that had been his entire existence was now slipping away from him, replaced by the undeniable force of nature pulling him toward the unknown. And as he was drawn toward the light, Elias knew one thing for certain. It was not the end. It was the beginning of everything. The day came. It was unlike anything Elias had imagined, a mix of pain, fear, and overwhelming joy. When he finally emerged, the world was blindingly bright and impossibly vast. He cried, his first sound in the outside world, as his mother held him close. "You're here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My miracle boy." Elias looked up at her, the woman whose heartbeat had been his world, and smiled. Though he had left the womb, he knew he would always carry her love within him, a light that would guide him through every step of his new life.